Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Okay, so you guys have been sending in a ton of stuff about Kamala Harris.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and specifically about these plagiarism allegations against her.
Hmm.
Yeah, we've got articles from Blaze News, CNN, and even the NY Post all covering this.
So what are we thinking? Dive in and see what's really going on.
Exactly. We'll look at what the accusations are, how they've kind of evolved, and what different people are saying about it all.
Sounds good.
Okay, so to get started, a lot of this seems to stem from the Washington Free Beacon.
Okay.
They're the ones who really started digging into Harris's 2007 testimony
Uh-huh.
before the House Judiciary Committee.
Right.
And they claim that a lot of it seems to be taken from a previous testimony by Paul Logley, a Republican attorney.
Oh, wow.
And what's crazy is the amount of overlap the Free Beacon found.
Like, how much are we talking?
They said something like 80% of the two testimonies are similar.
No way. 80%.
Yeah, including the exact same statistics, wording, even typos.
Huh. That's interesting.
And you know what's even wilder?
What's that?
Logley himself is actually quoted in both the Free Beacon and the NY Post articles.
Really?
He says he thinks it was probably the staff at the NDAA who wrote both testimonies.
Why would they do that?
Well, he suggests they probably did it to make sure the testimonies had a consistent message, you know.
Ah, I see.
So it doesn't really sound like he believes Harris was intentionally plagiarizing.
Yeah, right.
But it's interesting because CNN also talked to some experts, though they don't say who these experts are.
Interesting.
And these experts express more concern about the whole situation, even though they admit that these kinds of shared drafting practices are pretty common in politics.
So we've already got different opinions on this right from the start.
Exactly. It's a gray area for sure.
Okay, so we've got the Free Beacons investigation.
Yeah.
What else are we looking at?
Well, then the NY Post jumps in and brings up another example of alleged plagiarism, this time from a 2012 report Harris wrote about human trafficking.
Okay.
And this one is particularly strange.
How so?
They claim that Harris took a fictional case study from the Polaris Project website.
A fictional case study.
Yeah, one that was just meant as an example.
Okay.
And she presented it as if it were a real incident that happened in San Francisco.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so even though the Polaris Project makes it clear that the example was fictional, the fact that Harris used it, even though she changed the location, definitely blurs the line between illustration and reality, you know?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Makes you think about how careful you have to be, especially when you're dealing with a sensitive topic like human trafficking.
Absolutely, especially when you're in a position of power like that.
Definitely. And then the NY Post goes on to mention a whole bunch of other instances of potential plagiarism in Harris's work.
Like what?
Well, they talk about similarities between the 2011 report she did and some work by former Attorney General Bill Lockyer.
Mm-mm.
And then they point out some passages in the 2014 report that seem to be pretty much identical to stuff Judge Roger McDonough wrote.
So it's not just one isolated incident then?
It seems like there's a pattern here, right?
Yeah, a pattern of borrowing from different sources without always giving proper credit.
And to add to all of this, just last week, Christopher Rufo,
Who's that?
he's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute.
Okay.
He came out and said that Harris's 2009 book, Smart on Crime,
Oh, yeah, I remember that book.
also contains unattributed passages, so potentially more plagiarism.
Huh. Well, this is getting more and more complicated.
It is. But there's a curious detail in the NY Post article.
What's that?
They quote this guy named Joshua Lisek, who says he spoke to Joan O.C. Hamilton.
Wait, who's Joan O.C. Hamilton?
She's the ghostwriter who actually wrote Harris's book.
Oh, right.
And Lisek suggests that Hamilton probably wasn't even aware of any plagiarized content.
So now it's like, who's really responsible? The author or the ghostwriter?
It's a tricky question, right? Especially
Yeah.
when you've got multiple people involved in creating a piece of work.
Absolutely.
So in this first part, we've looked at some of the specific accusations against Kamala Harris, where they came from, and some initial reactions.
Definitely a lot to unpack here.
For sure.
So what's next?
Well, next, we should probably dig into the specifics of these allegations, look at exactly what the claims are, and how strong the evidence really is.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, stay tuned for that in part 2.
I'm ready. Welcome back. So are we ready to dig into these plagiarism allegations against Kamala Harris?
Let's do it. Where do we even begin?
Well, we could start with that 2007 congressional testimony that we talked about earlier.
Oh, yeah, the one with all the overlapping content and the identical typos.
Exactly. I mean, the Free Beacon really highlighted how similar those two testimonies were, right down to specific numbers and phrases.
They're pretty hard to ignore that.
Right. And while Paul Logley, the guy whose testimony was supposedly copied from, said it was probably just because of shared drafting practices within the NDAA, those unnamed experts that CNN spoke to seemed a bit more hesitant.
Yeah, it does make you wonder if there's more to it than just staff preparing similar materials.
For sure. And then there's that whole thing with Harris's 2012 report on human trafficking that the NY Post brought up.
Oh yeah, the one where she presented a fictional case study as a real event.
Exactly. That one's really tricky because while the Polaris Project clearly intended that case study to be just an example, the way Harris used it without any attribution could have been misleading.
Especially for people who didn't know the original source material.
Right. And it's not like this was the only instance of potential plagiarism that the NY Post found.
Yeah, they pointed out several other examples.
Like the similarities between her 2011 report and former AG Bill Lockyer's work.
And those passages in her 2014 report that mirrored Judge McDonough's writings.
It definitely seems like there's a pattern here.
A pattern of borrowing from others without always giving credit.
And what's interesting is that even though the articles lay out all these detailed accusations, they also mention that Harris's campaign hasn't responded to any of them.
Yeah, that silence is pretty deafening, isn't it?
It makes you wonder how they plan on addressing these allegations, if at all.
It's a tough situation for them.
Definitely. On one hand, they need to protect Harris's reputation and make sure she's seen as a credible candidate.
But on the other hand, responding directly to these accusations could give them more attention than they want.
It's a delicate balance.
So, given all these allegations and the lack of response from the campaign, what does all this mean for Harris's chances of winning the election?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
I mean, how do voters typically view plagiarism? Does it actually affect their trust in a candidate?
It's hard to say for sure, but in a political climate where fake news and misinformation are everywhere, you'd think voters would be extra sensitive to issues of authenticity and originality.
Makes sense.
When someone plagiarizes, it raises doubts about their honesty and whether they're trying to deceive people, which are definitely not qualities you want in a leader.
And the NY Post article even quotes Trump's campaign calling Harris a chameleon and suggesting these accusations could damage her image,
It's smart politics, really.
playing on those concerns about honesty and integrity.
Yeah, using those allegations to their advantage.
So we've got these specific instances of alleged plagiarism, the silence from Harris's campaign, and the potential political fallout.
What's next? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think it's time to zoom out a little and consider the bigger picture.
Okay, I like that.
How do we define plagiarism in a way that makes sense in different contexts?
That's a great question. Plagiarism isn't just a political problem, right? It happens in academia, journalism, the arts, pretty much any field where originality is valued.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we figure out where the line is? What are the ethical and social norms around using other people's work?
It's a tough challenge, but we need to have these conversations if we want to encourage intellectual honesty.
We need to talk about why giving credit is important, what the limits of fair use are, and what the consequences of plagiarism should be.
And those conversations need to happen across all different fields and parts of society.
It's about creating a shared understanding of how we use and respect other people's work.
Exactly. And this brings us right back to Kamala Harris and these allegations against her.
Whether they turn out to be true or not, they highlight just how important these discussions are.
We need to hold ourselves and our leaders to high ethical standards.
Okay, so we've looked at these specific allegations, the potential political fallout, and the broader ethical implications.
A lot to think about.
It's been a real deep dive.
And we've only scratched the surface of a very complex issue.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've spent all this time on these accusations against Kamala Harris, and it feels like we're dealing with a mix of genuine concern and political maneuvering.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tangled web, isn't it? We've got all these detailed examples from those articles, but then we also have Logley's perspective on how things work in the government.
Right, and then there's the fact that Harris's campaign hasn't even addressed these allegations.
It makes you think, how much of this is about ethics and how much is about politics, especially during such a close election?
That's a good point, because it raises a question for everyone following this election.
What's that?
How do we know what to believe? How do we separate legitimate concerns from just political attacks?
That's the challenge these days, right? We're bombarded with information from all sides, and everyone seems to have an agenda.
So how do we as news consumers figure out what's real and what's not?
Well, I think the key is to be really critical of the information we come across.
What do you mean?
We can't just take everything at face value. We need to look at the source consider different perspectives, and watch out for stories that seem too biased or one-sided.
That makes sense. And it's also important to remember that plagiarism itself isn't always a clear-cut issue, right?
Absolutely. There are different levels of seriousness, and the context really matters.
Like accidentally forgetting to cite a source is different from intentionally copying someone else's work word for word.
Exactly. And in this case, we have a whole range of opinions.
Yeah, we've got Logley talking about shared drafting, those unnamed experts in the CNN article who are worried, and then Harris's campaign just staying silent.
It just adds more layers to the whole thing.
Okay, so we've looked at the allegations, the evidence, the different opinions, and the potential political consequences.
A lot to consider.
What's the bottom line for our listeners? What should they take away from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is to be critical thinkers and make informed judgments for yourselves. Don't just accept everything you hear. Look at things from different angles and be cautious of narratives that seem too simplistic or one-sided.
And we need to remember the political context surrounding these accusations as well.
Right. There may be motives at play that go beyond just ethical concerns, and plagiarism itself is a complex issue with a lot of gray areas.
So it's up to each of us to weigh the evidence, think about the different perspectives, and come to our own conclusions.
Exactly. There's no easy answer here, but it's through thoughtful discussion and debate that we can really understand these complex issues.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We've explored the allegations against Harris, the potential political fallout, and the broader ethical questions surrounding plagiarism.
It's been a fascinating, albeit complicated journey.
For sure.
Mhm.
But remember, this conversation isn't over. These issues will continue to be discussed and debated.
So stay engaged, stay informed, and stay curious.
And thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.